Hey everyone, All Things Sports here by Mike McIntyre, and I'm here today to bring you a video that is probably going to bring up a bit of controversy. I've seen a lot of videos online about the difference between firm ground and AG stud patterns, what's suitable for artificial turf, what isn't, and all sorts of debates, about what works and what doesn't work. And I did a video almost 2 years ago now about my Magista Obras, and I showed what happened to them. I had a durability concern, I had the sole plate crack, and a lot of people think it was simply due to it being a firm ground stud pattern. And of course, I play on both turf and sometimes grass. So, it's about what can be used on what kind of surface. And now they have shoes that have AG stud patterns. They have shoes that have firm ground stud patterns, which the majority of the ones you see right here are all firm ground stud patterns. And we're just going to talk about what might have caused that issue, or what can you expect from firm ground shoes, or what can you expect from AG shoes, and what's really the difference. I just want to sort of address a few of the concerns and why that sort of happened. And I just want to point out some of the similarities that you may see across some of the shoes you see right here. So I have a few in front of me. Most of these are all mine, but this one here is Nick's. You may have seen the video I posted about this shoe in the last few days. I did a review on the Nike Magista Opuses, but I wanted to do this video while I still had these, because this sole plate is the exact same one as on the Magista Obras, and I had a pair of the Magista Obras. And that was the shoe that sort of cracked on me. If you guys go back and look at that video, there's a crack that happened right here, okay? And a lot of people are like, oh, that's because you wore them on turf. That's because you wore them on turf. My argument is that the crack didn't happen because I wore them on turf. That's not the case. It was just something that happened. They cracked for whatever reason. And I just want to point out the differences, okay? So a few years ago, we wouldn't even be having this debate. Artificial ground stud patterns didn't exist, okay? All you bought were firm ground stud patterns. So I have two older shoes right here. This is from a long time ago. These are the Adi Power Predators, okay? So Adidas Predator Adi Power. These were released in 2010 or 11. I think it was 11. Okay, so about 5-6 years ago. You can see these have a bladed stud pattern, okay? These are the Nike Mercurial Vapor 5s, okay? And these came out, well, I think these were 8 or 9, 2008 or 2009, I don't even remember. But roughly around that time period. It might have even been after that. It might have been 10 as well. 2009, 2010. Anyways, so these shoes are the oldest ones here. And then I have a bunch of different ones here, okay? So I've got, just for anyone that's curious, Nike Mercurial Vapor 5s, Adidas Adi Power Predator, Adidas Ace 15.1, that's last year, Adidas Ace 16 Plus Pure Control, Nike Magista Opuses, Adidas Predator LZs, okay, so these came out in 2012, I believe, and then Nike Hypervenom Phantom, the first generation, okay, so I have a bunch of different shoes here, and I just want to point out some of the similarities, some of the differences. First of all, what is an AG stud pattern? So an AG stud pattern basically has shorter, okay, in length, okay, so the studs are not as long. They're shorter studs, usually all conical, and they're placed in a way that's going to relieve pressure on the sole plate, okay? The idea being that if you have studs that are too long and very few studs, so example, a 6 stud pattern, that's something that you'd use on soft ground with the metal studs. Those are six studs. Pattern like that usually has, for example, 6 studs, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the front, and 2 in the heel. Okay, that was something we very commonly saw a few years ago. Now they're starting to integrate soft ground stud patterns that have a combination of normal plastic studs and metal studs, but 6 ground stud patterns still exist. Wayne Rooney is one of the more popular ones, I think. His stud pattern on his Hypervenoms are still 6 stud patterns, so he's got the 2 in the heel, metal, and then just 4 metal studs in the front. So if you use a stud pattern like that, basically there's very few studs, right? So there's pressure throughout the sole plate. The studs aren't relieving pressure because you might have those pressure points in those certain areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 3 or 4 studs, and 2 in the heel. So you've got a big gap between studs. There's a longer distance between studs, which might cause more stud pressure. So if you use a pattern like that on turf, that would very likely give you problems. One, because the studs are so long. Two, they're metal, right? So they're not going to be nearly as forgiving as a pair of plastic studs. Once they dig into the ground, those things aren't moving. They're long and they're tough, okay? So they're not going to move in the ground on turf. That's why you never wear metal stud patterns on turf. Now, I know most people probably know this, but it's just worth mentioning to sort of get my sort of point across. So you're never going to wear a stud pattern like that on turf because they're too long, there's not enough studs, and they're extremely, extremely durable. They're metal studs after all. Plastic ones are a little bit more forgiving, let's say, okay? So that's the idea, okay? So AG, all this in turn, AG stud patterns are meant to sort of reduce the amount of stud pressure that the sole plate experiences when interacting with the ground. Okay, so that's why you see, I did a video on a pair of Nike Tiempo Legend 6s, they're my friend Raymond's. Those had an AG stud pattern on them. And I don't have a pure AG stud pattern here with me because I don't own an AG stud pattern, but the closest one was the Adidas Ace Firm Ground, the Adidas Ace 15.1s. Okay, this is last year's model. And we're going to talk about why I brought these two shoes up in a second. But this is the closest I have to a pure AG stud pattern. Now it isn't, it's a firm ground / AG stud pattern, but this is very similar to what an artificial ground stud pattern will look. They have a lot of studs, they're smaller, and there's a lot of studs relieving pressure. Okay, and you can see majority of times they're all conical. So basically, if you were to use these on turf, Adidas say it, and that's where a lot of people get their information from. Oh, Adidas said they're fine to use on turf, you can use them on turf. Now, just because a company says you can or you can't use them on turf, usually that's a suggestion, a recommendation, and most of the time they're right. I'm not going to take that away from them. Okay, but my point being is just because a company says you can use them or that you can't use them doesn't, I mean, in the end, the decision's up to you. Okay, that's the point I'm just basically going to make. You know your own sort of comfort level. Okay, only you know what you're comfortable in. Only you know, different people have different preferences. I might like this stud pattern here, but some of my teammates might completely hate it and prefer something like this. It's very, very opinionated. Okay, it's very, very subjective. Someone has preferences, so that's why they create different stud patterns. So an artificial ground is going to be a lot more like this. Okay, so studs are closer together and they're not nearly as long, and they'll be a bit more forgiving. You can use them on a synthetic surface. They'll dig into the ground, they'll provide you enough traction, but they're not long enough to get stuck in that turf and prevent someone from twisting and turning, potentially causing injuries. Okay, so that's why they've created stud patterns like this. Years ago, they didn't have anything like this. It was simply firm ground studs. All they created were firm ground stud patterns. AG stud patterns didn't exist. Okay, so back in the generation of these two shoes, okay, you didn't have a choice. You couldn't say, oh, I want a firm ground stud pattern or I want that same shoe in artificial ground. That's the shoe you wanted in studs. You get that one. If you wanted it indoors, you could. But that was it. You didn't have the choice. So if you look at these two stud patterns here, these are blades, and they're a lot less common now. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. But these are bladed studs. You can see, first of all, they're long. They look like blades, hence why they're called bladed studs, for those of you that don't know. Okay, they're longer. They're longer in the sense of okay, you can see they're not conical. They're longer this way. I don't mean longer as in depth. I just mean longer as in the length of the stud itself. Okay, so these are bladed studs. You can see on the Mercurial Vapor. This is actually one of the few shoes that still has bladed studs. The Mercurial Vapor, and even the Mercurial Vapor 10s, excuse me, and the Superflies still have sort of bladed studs. So you can see these are bladed studs. Now, the reason these ones, I remember, just to give you a bit of a story, okay, I wore these on turf all the time. I never had an injury, okay, I never had a turf-related injury, knock on wood, but I never had an injury, but I didn't have the same amount of traction with this stud pattern as I did with these that came out the year later, and I much preferred this one. Reason being, these, okay, it's not quite conical, but you can see on the LZ2s here, they're triangular. So very, very similar to this, okay? It's going to allow you to pivot. So depending on how your foot digs into the ground, let's say when you're striking a ball, for example, your planted foot, okay, is going to dig into the ground. With these studs, everything was going forward. So when I would step into the ground, the bladed studs would dig in, but they would just slide, right, going forward. If my momentum's carrying me forward, the blades are in the same, they're parallel to the motion that my body's going, so they would just sort of slide. With these, you've got different angles with them. The studs are triangular, so if you were to dig in a certain way, this angle here might prevent you from sliding forward. If you were to make a hard cut laterally, this angle on the outside is going to help you get that traction and push off that foot. So I hope you're following me in that sense. So the bladed studs, I had a bit of slippage issues with these patterns down here, with this one down here, because it just didn't offer the same sort of traction that these newer stud patterns did. And I think that's why companies started to move towards some of the stud patterns you see here. Not many companies have bladed studs on their shoes anymore. So that's the point I was trying to make. That's why I brought those out. These are not very common anymore. You're not going to see a lot of shoes that have these. Companies have moved in to this sort of stud pattern. Now, so I've made it clear what AGs are. These are all firm ground. Now I want just to make a point, okay? So they've made this stud pattern. Adidas in particular made this stud pattern. Okay, this shoe is the LZ2. This came out in about 2012. Now the difference between this one and this one is barely anything. The shape of the studs is a little bit different. This one's a pure conical and this is triangular. But if you look at the layout, if you look at the length, if you look at the sheer surface area of the stud, they are the exact same. These two are bigger than these two. If you look at the LZ2, the two at the back are bigger than these two. These two in the middle right here are a bit larger than the two on the ends. If you look at the stud pattern here, these two studs are a bit larger than those. Okay, you have that one pivot stud in the middle. That's going to provide a bit more stability throughout the midfoot. It's going to allow you to pivot and stuff. So they released this stud pattern almost 5 years ago now. They released this stud pattern this year. Almost the exact same. They released this stud pattern last year. This is a 2015 Adidas Ace 15.1. This shoe was marketed and told, they have it everywhere, that this shoe could be used on firm ground and artificial ground. Great. A pure hybrid. Okay? They released the Ace this year. They went back to this stud pattern, one we've seen for years. They now say that this one can be used on both firm ground and artificial ground. So my point is, Adidas made this stud pattern, basically they made this stud pattern 5 years ago. They just didn't say it was firm ground / AG. If you look at the tags they include now, this came with a little tag that said it could be used on firm ground and artificial ground. They made this 5 years ago, but it didn't come with that tag. So people are under the impression that shoes, you know, they're made for this and that's all they can be used on. Or they're now that you need an artificial ground for a turf. So I'm just basically here saying, what is the difference between this one and this one? One is AG friendly, the other one apparently isn't. What's the difference? That's up to you to decide, but bottom line is there's really not that much of a difference. The other reason I brought the Opus out here, it's just to make a point. Okay, what is the difference between this stud pattern and this stud pattern right here? You've got 4 on the heel, all conical, basically in the same spot. You've got stiffener bars that run through the midfoot to provide you that stability. You have these 2 here basically doing the same role. You have these 3 down here, 1, 2, 3 making a pivot stud. You've got 2 in the front. This is almost the exact same layout as this. Basically it is. They've even added, Nike's even added an extra level of studs. So here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the front, and they've just added an extra line, if you will. You've got 1, 2, 1, 2. You've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Nike decided, oh, let's add even more. So you've got an extra line of 3, 1, 2, 3. And then you've got your 2 in the front. Okay? So I'm asking you, what is the difference between this? They've added more studs to reduce stud pressure even more. So what is the difference between this one and this one? This one is AG friendly. This one is marketed as firm ground. This is the stud pattern I had on the Magista Obras. This is the one that cracked. Now, it's not to say that this is a fault, but it's just to point out that it is basically the exact same stud pattern as this. The only difference is Nike did not market it as firm ground / AG. So if I chose to wear this on turf, which is basically the same stud pattern as this, which can be worn on turf, the reason this one broke on my Magista Obras is not because of turf. Okay, it's just simply due to perhaps the way I moved in it. Maybe I got kicked. I still don't know the reason. Okay, maybe I got cleated in a certain way and the stud pattern and the sole plate cracked. So the reason I made this video is just to point out the differences between AG and firm ground. You want to buy a shoe that is comfortable for you, number one. You don't want it to have any stud pressure, okay? You want it to be forgiving in the sense that you can wear it on different surfaces. Now, like I said, most companies are making sole plates now that can be worn across a variety of surfaces. You even see many pros that play on perfect grass wearing a firm ground stud pattern. They don't even have metal studs anymore. If you look at Rakitic, for example, he wears the Ace Pure Control 16 Plus here. He wears it with the firm ground stud pattern. He doesn't have metal studs. A lot of them are in the same boat. So the point is, companies are much more aware of what works and what doesn't across a variety of different stud patterns. They make AG, if you solely play on AG, they make that to give you that option. Okay, they see a value in producing a shoe with an artificial ground stud pattern. So if you solely play on turf and you like the way an artificial ground stud pattern feels, by all means go for it. It's great. It's going to work perfectly for what you need it for. But if you're someone that has grown up like I did with having only a firm ground option, maybe I'm a little hard-headed, very possible, but I like the way this feels and I'm used to it. It's something I've used for years. I'm going to stick with a firm ground stud pattern. The fact that companies have started to make them now saying they can be used on both is just a bonus. Now I can use this on both artificial ground and firm ground. So it's a stud pattern I've liked for years. It's something I've used to. It's something I've grown up using. And now I can use it on both surfaces because Adidas included that little tag. Then great. Okay, so I just want people to be aware out there what's the actual difference between artificial ground and firm ground, because the reality is in today's modern age, they're not that different. Now, if you would have asked me what's the difference between an artificial ground stud pattern and a firm ground stud pattern when these shoes were being produced, there was a difference. Look at the difference between these shoes. Look how long they are. Look at the way look how sharp the angles are. Look at the way the studs are arranged. This is asking for trouble on turf just because of how it's made. The angles aren't as forgiving. You might turn in one direction, and look at these two studs here. It's going to get caught. But if you look at these ones over here, they're all conical. They can pivot. And the amount of pressure that you get in between is reduced because of how close the studs are together. If you look at all these shoes here, it's fairly close together. Actually, the Hypervenom is one that's a little bit different. The gap between the heel studs and the forefoot is actually quite significant in comparison to, say, these shoes you see here. So that's just another reason I brought it, just to show you. But if you look at these shoes here, the studs are arranged in a way that's going to allow somebody to pivot, and they're all proven, and the reality is they're really not that different. No matter what company you go through, Puma, Nike, Adidas, all the stud patterns on today's silos are very, very similar. Adidas has implemented this one on all their lines. Now, it might be a little bit different. It might be triangular. It might be conical. But the idea, okay, the concept is basically the same. Across all their lines, Adidas is using something like this right now in 2016. In almost all of Nike's shoes, except for the Vapor and the Superfly, which is a little bit different, the Legends, the Hypervenoms, and the Magista line is very, very similar to this stud pattern you see right here. Look at the Hypervenom. You've got 4 conical in the back, 4 conical in the back. You got stiffener bars here, stiffener bars here. You have a few less studs on the Hypervenom in the front, but they're all conical, same as the Magista there. So if you really, really pay attention to how these are made, they aren't that different. And I just want people to be aware of what the true differences are between artificial ground and firm ground. Artificial ground is made for a reason. It's definitely going to be very forgiving. Maybe that's the way to phrase it. If you want a shoe that is very, very forgiving, something that you barely feel any pressure on the bottom of your foot, go for artificial ground. Something similar to this, it's going to relieve that pressure. But if you're used to firm ground, go for firm ground. It might be more comfortable for you. It might be something you're used to. And that's just the way it is for me. Again, I'm not here to make this video to say you have to do this, you have to do that. It's just to point out some of the similarities across the lines that we see in today's modern soccer shoe. I just want people to realize, what AGs are made for and stuff like that. So again, all of these videos, this is just my opinion. I just want to make that very, very clear. It's just sort of pointing out the very similar aspects of all these shoes that you see today. So I thank you guys for watching. I hope I made my point. It's just sort of, again, it's just to bring, any sort of soccer shoe enthusiast like me, gosh, a bunch of other guys you see on YouTube. We just like talking about soccer shoes. So you can come up with basically any sort of discussion, and everyone can bring a point forward, pros and cons. Everyone has an opinion. So that's the great part about just being involved in this sort of stuff. You can talk about different things. So that's it for today's video, guys. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them down. Let's try and be respectful towards everyone, guys. I mean, a comment board is definitely a place where some people can you know, just they can just go wild with what they say. They're not thinking, for whatever reason, they're not thinking about other people's opinions. They're just trying to bash on others. So let's just keep it respectful. If you guys have a comment or question, be sure to leave it down. We can get a friendly discussion going. But let's just make sure it's appropriate, respectful, and be respectful of everybody's comments. So that's it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. This is Mike McIntyre with All Things Sports. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you haven't subscribed, be sure to do so. There'll be some more videos coming out. And again, thank you guys for watching. Mike McIntyre from All Things Sports, and take care, guys.